Hey line walkers, this is Jaime A. Heidel, the Articulate Autistic, and I'm here with a brand new video. This one is called Why Autistic People Do That, video 34, Questions Are Just Questions, Not Rudeness. Now, this is something that I have talked about on my Facebook page a few times, and I've gone a little bit in depth with it, so if you want to go back and read over those posts, that might be helpful. But I'm just going to basically go over the basics of this misunderstanding that autistic people have with non-autistic people. This seems to be one of the most common misunderstandings, and actually one of the things that causes the most miscommunication and also the most violent miscommunication in some ways. So first, I'd like to address the question of why. Autistic people usually ask why quite often. It is because we want to understand your instructions as clearly as possible. We want to make sure that we understand why we're doing something, because when we understand why we're doing something, we can integrate that into our understanding of a request or a task, and we will be much more likely to remember what you asked us to do in the future if we understand the reasoning behind it. So that's why we ask why very often. So if you have an autistic person in your life and they're asking you why all the time, that is probably, no pun intended, why. I also, I was writing about when an autistic person asks a question, it's a question that is seeking more information. The purpose of asking a question is to seek more information, and that's the only reason an autistic person will ask a question, usually. From what I understand from my reading and my experiences in life, apparently neurotypical people and non-autistic people use questions for other reasons other than just to clarify information. Sometimes it is used as an attempt to get out of a situation or get out of doing something. Sometimes it is an attempt to question the person's authority. Sometimes it's a matter of sometimes this is, once again, I'm stumbling over my words. One of the things that is difficult to understand and even to explain is that sometimes questions are meant as a threat. So, for example, do you understand what I'm saying? Now, I swear I just triggered a bunch of people saying that. Because when you ask that, like if an autistic person were to ask you that, we would mean, do you understand? Like literally, are you understanding what I'm saying? Am I being clear enough? Do you need more information? Because we want to make sure that you're not confused. Like we can get confused really easily. So we want to make sure that you're not confused too, and that we're both on the same page. So if somebody says it, usually it's a non-autistic person who will say it, who will say, do you understand? And depending on the tone of voice that's used and depending on the look, it can mean several things. But here's the issue. Autistic people often have a really difficult time understanding facial expressions and body language, so we may not grasp that. We'll just hear the question and we pay very, very close attention to your words and we respond to your words. It's the words that, that's where we get our information. So if somebody says, do you understand, but they're doing it in such a way that they're standing over us, they're glaring at us, and there's just this, even if we can't read the facial expression and the tone of voice, we can definitely feel the energy, and there's a negative energy that is coming at us, and we know something is wrong, but we don't know what it is. Another one that's very common is you think you have, or what is it? Another one that's very common that I just wrote about is you have the answer for everything, don't you? That is such a terrible thing to say. It really is, because it's so confusing. I think for anybody, regardless of neurotype, I think that that's unnecessary to say. Usually, I think people will say that because they're trying to get a message across. They're trying to say, right now you sound smug, or you sound like a know-it-all, or they're waiting for the other person to concede to their authority and say, you were right, I was wrong. So that's a confusing thing for an autistic person to hear. You have the answer for everything, and after they've just answered a bunch of questions, they might look at you and say, well, yes. And they're not being, they're not being insolent, they're not being rude, they're not questioning your authority. It's just, we're literal. So we're answering the question literally. And this can be a huge disconnect. And it can cause, depending on, who we're talking to, it can cause severely abusive responses. I mean, I can tell you from my own personal experience, I've gotten screamed at, I've gotten punished, I've gotten hit because I asked a question or I answered a question literally, not understanding that the question had a different meaning behind it, not reading the facial expressions or the body language that went along with it. So it's one of the reasons that I have PTSD, because there was just such a huge communication gap. I was also accused of backtalking all the time when I was younger, but I wasn't backtalking in, I was saying, I disrespect your authority, I disrespect you. It was more like I would just ask questions so that I could be more clear and I would know what was going on, and I would have less of a likely time of making a mistake, because when I made a mistake, I would get punished for that too. So I kind of felt like I couldn't win. And I think that a lot of people who are on the spectrum feel the same way and have experienced the same things. So if you have an autistic person in your life who is asking you a ton of questions, please understand that the question is a request for more information. We don't really have a thought of challenging your authority. That's not really where we're coming from. And I probably should do a separate video on this, but also we don't understand social hierarchy. It's something that we can learn, but it's not something that's ingrained in us. So we'll talk to the CEO of a company the same way we would speak to a janitor, or a billionaire the same way we would speak to a homeless person, or we would speak the same exact way to an elder or a child. There's no real understanding of that social hierarchy, and I think that's good to put in with this and to understand, because it's really connected. An autistic child, for example, is not going to think anything of questioning their parent or their teacher or their clergyman, or this is just an attempt to understand information. In most of the time, and I can't speak for everyone, but most of the time with neurodiverse people, everybody's equal. That's just how we see it. Everybody's equal. So there's not this really understand of like this person's higher up and this person's lower down. Our brains just aren't wired that way. So that disconnect can happen too. Because I think if peers ask each other questions, you're not having as much of a conflict. Rather if it's a student asking a teacher and the teacher is just very annoyed and irritated and is taking the question as an insult, that's where you have your problems. Or if you do have an abusive family member or somebody in your family or somebody in your friendship circle, rather, that is abusive, this could escalate. Just asking a question could escalate into the autistic person experiencing emotional or physical harm. So I cannot stress this enough, that for autistic people, for people who are neurodiverse, this could mean someone who's not diagnosed autistic, but somebody who even has ADHD, although I don't understand how that works, so I don't usually mention it. But anybody who's neurodiverse, we're usually 9 times out of 10 asking a question to get clarification. So if for some reason we get screamed at or slapped upside the head or punished or ostracized, we have absolutely no idea what's happening, and it is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly traumatizing. I can definitely say that from experience, and also from the responses that I got to a lot of the posts that I've been putting out lately about the same topic. So one more time, with feeling, when a neurodiverse person asks you a question, we just want clarification. We need clarification so that we can understand what to do and we can have smoother interactions. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.